Section 1 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 1, Part 1. Sir Isaac Newton. When you come into any fresh company, observe their humours. Suit your own carriage thereto, by which insinuation you will make their converse more free and open. Let your discourse be more in queries and doubtings than peremptory assertions or disputings, it being the design of travellers to learn, not to teach. Besides, it will persuade your acquaintance that you have the greater esteem of them, and so make them more ready to communicate what they know to you. Whereas nothing sooner occasions disrespect and quarrels than peremptoriness. You will find little or no advantage in seeming wiser, or much more ignorant than your company. Seldom discommend anything, though never so bad, or do it but moderately, lest you be unexpectedly forced to an unhandsome retraction. It is safer to commend anything more than is due, than to discommend a thing so much as it deserves, for commendations meet not so often with oppositions, or at least are not usually so ill resented by men that think otherwise, as discommendations. You will insinuate into men's favour by nothing sooner than seeming to approve and commend what they like, but beware of doing it by a comparison. Sir Isaac Newton to one of his pupils. Sir Isaac Newton. An honest farmer, neither rich nor poor, was Isaac Newton. He was married to Harriet Ayscough in February 1642. Both were strong, intelligent, and full of hope. Neither had any education to speak of. They belonged to England's middle class, that oft despised and much ridiculed middle class which is the hope of the world. Accounts still in existence show that their income was £30 a year. It was for them to toil all the week, go to church on Sunday, and twice or thrice in a year attend the village fairs or indulge in a holiday where hard cider played an important part. Isaac had served his 2 years in the army, taken a turn at sea, and got his discharge papers. Now he had married the lass of his choice, and settled down in the little house on an estate in Lincolnshire where his father was born and died. Spring came and the roses clambered over the stone walls. The bobolinks played hide and seek in the waving grass of the meadows. The skylarks sang and poised and soared. The hedgerows grew white with hawthorn blossoms and musical with the chirp of sparrows. The cattle ranged through the fragrant clover, knee-deep in June. Oftentimes the young wife worked with her husband in the fields, or went with him to market. Great plans were laid as to what they would do next year, and the year after, and how they would provide for coming age and grow old together, here among the oaks and the peace and plenty of Lincolnshire. In such a country, with such a climate, it seems as if one could almost make repair equal waste, and thus keep death indefinitely at bay. But all men, even the strongest, are living under a death sentence, with but an indefinite reprieve. And even yet, with all of our science and health, we cannot fully account for those diseases which seemingly pick the very best flower of sinew and strength. Isaac Newton, the strong and rugged farmer, sickened and died in a week. The result of a cold caught when sweaty and standing in a draught, the surgeon explained. The act of God to warn us all of the vanity of life. Acute pneumonia, perhaps, is what we would call it, a fever that burned out the bellows in a week. In such cases the very strength of the man seems to supply fuel for the flames. And so, just as the autumn came with changing leaves, the young wife was left to fight the battle of life alone, alone save for the old, old miracle that her life supported another, a wife, a widow, a mother, all within a year. On Christmas Day the babe was born where most men die, in obscurity. He was so weak and frail that none but the mother believed he would live. The doctor quoted a line from Richard III: "Sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up," and gave the infant into the keeping of an old nurse with an ominous shake of the head, and went his way, absolved. His time was too valuable to waste on such a useless human mite. The persistent words of the mother that the child should not, must not die, possibly had something to do with keeping the breath of life in the puny man child. The fond mother had given him the name of his father, even before birth. He was to live to do the work that the man now dead had hoped to do, that is, live a long and honest life, and leave the fair acres more valuable than he found them. Such was the inauspicious beginning of what Herbert Spencer declared was the greatest life since Aristotle studied the starry universe. Outside of India, the lot of widows is not especially to be pitied. A widow has beautiful dreams, while the married woman copes with the stern reality. Then no phase of life is really difficult when you accept it, and the memory of a great love lost is always a blessing and a benediction to the one who endures the first cruel shock. The young widow looked after her little estate, and with perhaps some small assistance from her parents, lived comfortably and as happily as one has a right to in this vale of tears. Her baby boy had grown strong and well. By the time he was 2 years old he was quite the equal of most babies, and his mother thought, beyond them. It is quite often stoutly declared by callow folks that mother love is the strongest and most enduring love in the world. But the wise waste no words on such an idle proposition. Mother love retires into the shadow when the other kind appears. When the Reverend Barnabas Smith began, unconsciously, to make eyes at the widow Newton over his prayer book, the good old dames whose business it is to look after these things, and perform them vicariously, made prophecies on the way home from church as to how soon the wedding would occur. People go to church to watch and pray, but a man I know says that women go to church to watch. Young clergymen fall an easy prey to designing widows, he avers. I can discover no proof, however, that the widow Newton made any original designs. She was below the young clergyman in social standing, and when the good man began to pay special attentions to her baby boy, she never imagined that the sundry pats and caresses were meant for her. Little Isaac Newton was just 3 years old when the wedding occurred, and was not troubled about it. The bride went to live with her husband at the rectory a mile away, and the little boy in dresses with long yellow curls was taken to the home of his grandmother. The Reverend Barnabas Smith didn't like babies as well as he had at first thought. Grandparents are inclined to be lax in their discipline. And anyway, it is no particular difference if they are. A scarcity of discipline is better than too much. More boys have been ruined by the rod than saved by it. Love is a good substitute for a cat o' nine tails. There were several children born to the Reverend Barnabas Smith and his wife, and all were disciplined for their own good. Isaac, a few miles away, snuggled in the arms of his old grandmother when he was bad and went scot-free. Many years after, Sir Isaac Newton, in an address on education at Cambridge, playfully referred to the fact that in his boyhood he did not have to prevaricate to escape punishment, his grandmother being always willing to lie for him. His grandmother was his first teacher and his best friend, as long as she lived. When he was 12 years old he was sent to the village school at Grantham, 8 miles away. There he boarded with a family by the name of Clark, and at odd times helped in the apothecary shop of Mr. Clark, cleaning bottles and making pills. He himself has told us that the working with mortar and pestle, cutting the pills in exact cubes, and then rolling one in each hand between thumb and finger, did him a lot of good, whether the patients were benefited or not. The genial apothecary also explained that pills were for those who made and sold them, and that if they did no harm to those who swallowed them, the whole transaction was then one of benefit. All of which proves to us that men had the essence of wisdom 200 years ago, quite as much as now. The master of the school at Grantham was one Mr. Stokes, a man of genuine insight and tact, two things rather rare in the pedagogic equipment at that time. The Newton boy was small and stood low in his class, perhaps because book learning had not been the bent of his grandmother. The fact that Isaac was neither strong nor smart, nor even smartly dressed, caused him to serve in the capacity as a butt for the bullies. One big boy in particular made it his business to punch, kick, and cuff him on all occasions, in class or out. This continued for a month, when one day the little boy invited the big one out into the churchyard, and there fell upon him tooth and claw. The big boy had strength, but the little one had right on his side. The schoolmaster looked over the wall and shouted, "Thrice armed is he who knows his cause is just." In 2 minutes the bully was beaten, but the schoolmaster's son, who stood by as master of ceremonies, suggested that the big boy have his nose rubbed against the wall of the church for luck. This was accordingly done, not o'er gently, and when Isaac returned to the schoolroom, the master, who was supposed to know nothing officially of the fighting, prophesied, "Young Mr. Newton will yet beat any boy in this school in his studies." It has been suggested that this prophecy was made after its fulfillment, but even so, we know that Mr. Stokes lived long enough to take great pride in the Newton boy, and to grow reminiscent concerning his great achievements. Our hearts surely go out to the late Mr. Stokes, schoolmaster at Grantham. There is surely something in that old idea of Indians, that when they killed an enemy the strength of the fallen adversary entered into themselves. This encounter of little Isaac with the school bully was a pivotal point in his career. He had vanquished the rogue physically, and he now set to work to do as much mentally for the whole school. He had it in him; it was just a matter of application. Once in after life, speaking of those who had benefited him most, he placed this unnamed chucklehead first, and added with a smile, "Our enemies are quite as unnecessary to us as our friends." In a few months Isaac stood at the head of the class. In mathematics he especially excelled, and the master, who prided himself on being able to give problems no one could solve but himself, found that he was put to the strait of giving a problem nobody could solve. He was somewhat taken aback when little Isaac declined to work on it, and coolly pointed out the fallacy involved. The only thing for the teacher to do was to say he had purposely given the proposition to see if anyone would detect the fallacy. This he gracefully did, and again made a prophecy to the effect that Isaac Newton would some day take his own place and be master of Grantham School. In the year 1656 the school days of Isaac Newton were cut short by the death of his stepfather. His mother, twice a widow, moved back to Woolsthorpe, a big name for a very small estate. Isaac was made the man of the house. The ambition of his mother was that he should become a farmer and stock raiser. It seems that the boy entered upon his farm duties with an alacrity that was not to last. His heart was not in the work, but the desire to please his mother spurred him forward. On one occasion, being sent with a load of produce to Grantham, he stopped to visit his old school, and during his call struck a bargain with one of the boys for a copy of Descartes' Geometry. The purchase exhausted his finances, so that he was unable to buy the articles his mother had sent him for. But when he got home he explained that one might get along without such luxuries as clothing, but a good geometry was a family necessity. About this time he made a water clock, and also that sundial which can be seen today carved into the stone on the corner of the house. He still continued his making of kites, which had been begun at Grantham, and gave the superstitious neighbors a thrill by flying kites at night with lighted lanterns made from paper attached to the tails. He made water wheels and windmills, and once constructed a miniature mill that he ran by placing a mouse in a treadmill inside. In the meantime the cows got into the corn, and the weeds in the garden improved each shining hour. The fond mother was now sorely disappointed in her boy, and made remarks to the effect that if she had looked after his bringing up instead of entrusting him to an indulgent grandmother, affairs at this time would not be in their present state. Parents are apt to be fussy. They cannot wait. Matters reached a climax when the sheep that Isaac had been sent to watch overran the garden and demolished everything but the purslane and ragweed, while all the time the young man was under the hedge working out mathematical problems from his Descartes. At this stage the mother called in her brother, the Reverend Mr. Ayscough, and he advised that a boy who was so bound to study should be allowed to study, and the good man offered to pay the wages of a man to take Isaac's place on the farm. So, greatly to the surprise and pleasure of Mr. Stokes of Grantham, Isaac one fine day returned with his books, just as if he had only been gone a day instead of a year. At the home of the apothecary the lad was thrice welcomed. He had endeared himself to the women of the household especially. He did not play with other boys; their games and sports were absolutely outside of his orbit. He was silent and so self-contained that he won from his schoolfellows the sobriquet of Old Cold Feet. Nothing surprised him, he never lost his temper, he laughed so seldom that the incident was noted and told to the neighbors. His attitude was one of abstraction, and when he spoke it was like a judge charging a jury with soda water. All his spare time was given up to whittling, pounding, sawing, and making mathematical calculations. Not all of his inventions were toys, for among other things he constructed a horseless carriage which was run by a crank and pumping device by the occupants. The idea of the horseless carriage is a matter that has long been in the minds of inventors. Several men supremely great have tried their hands and head at it. Leibniz worked at it, Swedenborg prophesied the automobile and made a carriage, placing the horse inside, and did not give up the scheme until the horse ran away with himself and demolished a year's work. The government here interfered and placed an injunction against the making of any more such diabolical contrivances for the disturbance of the public peace. All of which makes us believe that if either Edison or Marconi had lived 200 years ago, the bailiffs would have looked after them with the butt end of the law for the regulation of wizards and witches, wizards at Menlo Park being as bad as witches at Salem. Newton's horseless carriage later came to grief in a similar way to Swedenborg's invention. It worked so well and so fast that it turned a complete somersault into a ditch, and its manipulation was declared to be a pastime more dangerous than football. Not all the things produced by Isaac about this time were failures. For instance, among other things he made a table, a chair, and a cupboard for a young woman who was a fellow boarder at the apothecary's. The excellence of young Newton's handiwork was shown in that the articles just mentioned outlasted both owner and maker. Much of the reminiscence concerning the Grantham days of Sir Isaac Newton comes from the fortunate owner of that historic old table, chair, and cupboard. This was Mary Story, who was later Mrs. Vincent. Miss Story was the same age as Isaac. She was just 18 when the furniture was made Roycrofty. She was a young lady grown, and wore a dress with a train. Moreover, she had been to London, and had been courted by a widower, while Isaac Newton was only a lad in roundabouts. Age counts for little. It is experience and temperament that weigh in the scale. Isaac was only a little boy, and Mary Story treated him like one. And here seems a good place to quote what Dr. Charcot said: "In arranging the formula for a great man, make sure you delay adolescence. Rare ripes rot early." Isaac and Mary became very good chums, and used to ramble the woods together hand in hand, in a way that must have frightened them both, had they been on the same psychic plane. Isaac had about the same regard for her that he might have had for a dear maiden aunt, who would mend his old socks and listen patiently, pretending to be interested when he talked of parallelograms and prismatic spectra. But evidently Mary Story thought of him with a thrill, for she stoutly resented the boys calling him "cold feet." In due time Isaac gravitated to Cambridge. Mary mooed a wee, but soon consoled herself with a sure enough lover, and was married to Mr. Vincent, a worthy man and true, but one who had not sufficient soul caloric to make her forget her Isaac. This friendship with Mary Story is often spoken of as the one love affair in the life of Sir Isaac Newton. It was all prosily platonic on his part, but as Mary lived out her life at Grantham, and Sir Isaac Newton used to go there occasionally, and when he did always called upon her, the relationship was certainly noteworthy. The only break in that lifelong friendship occurred when each was past 50. Sir Isaac Newton was paying his little yearly call at Grantham, and was seated in a rustic arbour by the side of Mrs. Vincent, now grown grey, and the mother of a goodly brood, well grown up. As they thus sat talking of days agone, his thoughts wandered off upon quadratic equations, and to aid his mind in following the thread, he absent-mindedly lighted his pipe and smoked in silence. As the tobacco died low, he gazed about for a convenient utensil to use in pushing the ashes down in the bowl of his pipe. Looking down, he saw the lady's hand resting upon his knee, and he straightway utilized the forefinger of his vis-a-vis. A suppressed feminine screech followed, but the fires of friendship were not quenched by so slight an incident, which Mrs. Vincent knew grew out of temperament, and not from wrong intent. She lived to be 85, and to the day of her death caressed the scar, the cicatrice of a love wound. All of which seems to prove that old women can be quite as absurd as young ones. Goodness me! End of section 1.